Oh, it's ready? We are ready to go? Okay, should we close doors or? Alrighty, I think we're just about ready to begin. Okay. Well, welcome to my mini course, Learning from Our Past, Healing Our Future, a Swedenborgian perspective on dismantling colonial dominance in Western Christianity. So thanks for being here with me, and hello to anyone on Zoom. Thanks for being with us. Alrighty, so I'm going to begin this morning with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge here in Bridgewater that we are on Wampanoag, Massachusetts, and Pokanoket land. The first language spoken on these lands is Massachusetts and Wampanoag, and it is important that we recognize and respect the original stewards of this territory. We pay our respect to elders both past and present and future. Sure. So we are on Wampanoag, Massachusetts, and Pokanoket land. We acknowledge that not only are we on their lands, that they are still here and part of this community. We also acknowledge that this is the home of many Indigenous people as a result of federal relocation policies and Indigenous migrants from the South. We honor their ancestors, elders, and community leaders, past, present, and into the future. We speak these words to honor the Wampanoag, Massachusetts, and Pokanoket peoples, and invite all who come here to reflect on their relationship to the histories of this land and the people. We invite you to get involved and do your part to work with and support Indigenous struggles on these lands. May the balance be restored. So, my friends, this past February, Swedenborgians in Action Against Racism, along with the Center for Swedenborgian Studies and Born Brown All Rights Reserved, arranged for the Reverend Dr. Randy Woodley to deliver a lecture over Zoom entitled Learning from Our Past, Healing Our Future, Dismantling Colonial Dominance in Western Christianity. Dr. Woodley is a farmer, author, activist, scholar, distinguished speaker and teacher, and Indigenous wisdom keeper. And in the lecture, Dr. Woodley outlined the ways that an excess of Western thinking, or the Western perspective, has led to a number of not only negative but brutal outcomes for humanity, and that Indigenous spirituality can help return us to a more balanced way of being. Or, as he phrased the question, what is it that can turn the same people who call themselves by Christ's name into a people who will kill, steal, and destroy people, land, and nature with a genocidal passion? So it was a fascinating and challenging lecture, and if you haven't been able to see it, I do encourage you to take a look. And for an expansion of these ideas, I do encourage you also to take a look at his book, Indigenous Theology in the Western Worldview, a Decolonized Approach to Christian Doctrine. And so I've drawn a lot of things from this book for this lecture today, and when I've quoted directly, you'll see a page number. So this mini-course is aimed at taking Dr. Woodley's insights and questions from his book and the lecture and applying them very specifically to our Swedenborgian context and our theology. And so I'm asking the questions. Are there threads of Western thinking that can be found in our theology? Are these threads harmful? And can we untangle these threads and maybe provide some balance where needed? So, just in terms of theology, the Swedenborgian tradition is actually already quite post-colonial already. You know, in an initial meeting with Dr. Woodley, I was explaining our theology to him, right? An emphasis on living a good life as opposed to specific beliefs, a rejection of a transactional atonement, a loving God rather than a judgmental God, diversity and unity, universalist salvation. And then he just asked me, well, what do you need me for, right? You know, our theology is already counterbalancing a fair number of worst features of colonial Western Christianity, and therefore there's a lot of confluence already with indigenous spirituality. However, Swedenborg was an Enlightenment thinker, fully steeped in the perspectives of that time and that movement, and so a number of typically Western ways of thinking are apparent in his works. And also, a lot of the Swedenborgian movement has been, and sort of currently is, part of Western culture. And so as our forebears and we ourselves interpret Swedenborg's works, we have done so from within the Western worldview, and that will necessarily impact how our interpretations have developed. So today, we're going to take a look at 4 typically Western ideas: dualism, hierarchy, individualism, and utopianism. And just a whole raft of caveats before I begin. Any critique offered here is, of course, done out of love, not from an accusation of lack, but from a vision of being able to be more in balance. And certainly the Swedenborgian thought world really is quite vast and often does feature opposing principles that naturally balance each other. And so while I'm intentionally bringing in indigenous wisdom here, there are certainly ideas from Swedenborg that might also serve, each other in the interest of balance in a similar way, as well as Eastern philosophy that has a lot to offer a conversation like this too. Second, I'm lifting up questions here. I'm just pulling out threads and lifting them up to the light. I don't have necessarily any answers, but I'm hoping to start a conversation and have you join. And finally, I certainly couldn't include everything that's mentioned in Dr. Woodley's book. There are other threads to pull on if we want, which include materialism, the spiritual utility of story, the universalizing of place, and the myth of progressive civilization, all that can wait for another day. And of course, I am by no means an expert in indigenous thinking. I always try to rely on others for that. So we can get started. We'll start out with looking at dualism, right? So as an umbrella term, dualism refers to the construct of having 2 fundamental principles of reality and then philosophically explores how they interact or maybe don't interact with each other. And you might be more familiar with Cartesian dualism, which outlines the separation of body and mind. And we are going to be talking in this context today more specifically about Platonic dualism. Right, and that is a broad line of thinking that places greater emphasis, greater value, or higher meaning in the ethereal, the spiritual, the metaphysical, or the abstract realm over the physical. Now, both Swedenborgian theology and indigenous theology, they could both be rightly characterized as panentheism, which is a worldview that spirit is present in all creation, while also maintaining that the divine transcends creation. However, even with that similar starting place, Swedenborg often veers quite strongly into Platonic dualism with a lot of his language, much more so than indigenous spirituality. And so here's an example from Secrets of Heaven, number 5013. For the spiritual is prior, more internal and higher, also closer to the divine, while the natural is posterior, more external and lower, and further removed from the divine. And for this reason, both with the individual person and within the church, the spiritual is compared to heaven and also actually called heaven, and the natural is compared to the earth and also actually called the earth. So that's an example from Swedenborg of Platonic dualism. So let's take a look then at how dualism might be harmful, because we might all be thinking, well, what's wrong with Platonic dualism? It seems to make sense to me. And, there's not anything particularly wrong with it as an idea. It's really to note what an excess of this type of thinking might have led to. From the perspective of more integrative worldviews like indigenous spirituality, Dualism cleaves apart things that should be together. It creates a harmful kind of disintegration of reality and leads to harmful binary thinking. The way Dr. Woodley puts it is that extrinsic categories are partial realities, and partial realities often become false realities. And so what he's talking about here is in the practice of dualism, we take reality, we cleave it into parts, right? We have these external categories that are really just partial representations of what really is, but then we might mistake them for what really is, live into those, and it becomes a false reality. So, and this is a problem, right? When it causes us to invest in the spiritual to a higher degree than the physical, to think perhaps that the God is at work in the church more than in the world at large, or to consider the land or the earth, or to consider external good works, or even our bodies as inherently suspect, right? And this, so you can see that dualism is going to start affecting all the other things that we're going to be talking about today. And it probably affects a lot of things that we don't even think about. For example, Glennon Doyle has done some interesting thinking on how a dualistic worldview relates to eating disorders, for example, the way that it disintegrates us with our bodies, or from our bodies. But one particularly harmful idea that an excessively dualistic spirituality has to offer is that human beings can be categorized apart from or above creation. And this can lead to a belief that human beings deserve to be able to use creation for our own purposes, that creation's resources belong to us and should serve our purposes, right? This is a dominion perspective rather than a stewardship perspective. And I think we can, of course, draw a direct line from this type of thinking to our current climate crisis. And unfortunately, there are certain ways that Swedenborg phrases his theology that does really exacerbate a dualistic way of thinking. So, for example, Divine Love and Wisdom 157. The physical world's sun is nothing but fire and is therefore dead. And since nature has its origin in that sun, nature is dead. In no respect whatever can creation itself be attributed to the physical world's sun. It is due entirely to the spiritual world's sun. And this is because the physical world's sun is totally lifeless, while the spiritual world's sun is alive, being the first emanation of divine love and wisdom. There is probably no more potent way to think about something dualistically than one is living and the other is dead. It's just really stark language. And so even though Swedenborg really does very, very often talk about how important the connection between the natural and the spiritual really is, and how one actually can't even exist without the other, at the same time, with language like this, it's just hard to avoid thinking, living is better than dead. So let's contrast that with the indigenous perspective. In Dr. Woodley's book, there's a 10-point description of what he calls the harmony way, a synthesis of many indigenous traditions from his research. And he talks about it sounding very much like humanity's original instructions. And the notion of balance or wholeness is an integral part of this indigenous worldview. And this balance doesn't equal perfection, but it's rather everything just doing what it was made to do. So part of living into balance is to notice when things become disintegrated, like with a dualistic perspective, and then to bring them back together in a practice of constant integration. So, to quote Dr. Woodley, in terms of how we think about the relationship of human beings and the earth, he says, in a harmony-based worldview, human beings are fully physical and the earth is fully spiritual. One is not categorized as higher or better than the other. The earth and everything in it is sacred, including human beings, but not only human beings. And when human beings are not categorized over and apart from creation, then we are much more likely to have a worldview of stewardship than domination or conquest. And instead, we might seek to be co-sustainers, learning with creation in a dynamic and organic process.
What was that last word?
Co-sustainers?
Okay.
Yes. So this process of being in partnership with creation. And actually, in yesterday's land acknowledgement mini course, a really great resource was lifted up, Lila June. So if you want to Google her TED Talk, that's a great example of what it looks like to be a co-sustainer with creation. And, with these perspectives, perhaps we could imagine healing the climate crisis, or maybe even not being here in the first place. So let's move on, after a sip of water, to hierarchy. So hierarchy just being any system of things that are ranked one above the other. And boy, does Swedenborg ever love hierarchy. As a scientist, of course, he just loved categorization, and categorization often leads to organization by hierarchy. Now, I can really relate to him on this, so this section is a little bit hard for me. My brain works by categorizing things as well, and it just feels natural, right? Satisfying. And categorization does not necessarily have to lead to hierarchy, but it just often does. At its best, categorization can lead to the specialization of knowledge, and this drives scientific discovery. So that's wonderful. But at its worst, it takes the harmful things about dualism, which is the tendency to cleave things apart, the tendency to make other or different, and then it uses that to create harmful hierarchy. And so here are some ways that Swedenborg uses, hierarchy shows up in Swedenborg's works. There's plenty of other examples as well. So Divine Love and Wisdom 65. The useful functions of everything created tend upward, step by step from the lowest to us, and through us to God the Creator, their source. The lowest are for the service of the intermediate, and the intermediate for the service of the highest. So the useful functions of all created things tend upwards in a sequence from the lowest to the human, which is primary in the divine design. So again, you can see how this one also plays into what we were just talking about, setting humans over or above creation. And now we're getting a little bit more, to the connection of the physical and the spiritual world with Divine Love and Wisdom 66. There are 3 ascending levels in the physical world and 3 ascending levels in the spiritual world. All animals are life receivers, the more perfect ones receiving the life of the 3 levels of the physical world, the less perfect receiving the life of 2 levels of that world, the least perfect the life of 1 level. Only we humans are receptive of the life, not only of the 3 levels of the physical world, but also the 3 levels of the spiritual world. And then finally, a little bit how this plays into our process from Divine Love and Wisdom 67. I need to explain briefly how we climb or are lifted from the last level to the first. We are born on the lowest level of the physical world and are lifted to the 2nd level by means of factual knowledge. And then, as we develop our discernment through this knowledge, we are lifted to the 3rd level and become rational. And the 3 ascending levels in the spiritual world are within this, resting on the 3 physical levels, and do not become visible until we leave our earthly bodies. And when we do, the 1st spiritual level is opened for us, then the 2nd, and finally the 3rd. And however, this happens only for people who become angels of the 3rd heaven. These are the ones who see God. So, how can hierarchy be harmful? Well, we've already seen how dualism, or Platonic dualism in particular, can lead to ranking some aspects of reality as higher or better than others, which leads to the categorization of human beings as above creation. And we can see how short a step then it is, really, from categorizing human beings as above creation to categorizing some human beings over other human beings. And as soon as we're categorizing and putting some people into a category called other or better, that often leads to dehumanization. And from there, we have racism, misogyny, white supremacy, toxic nationalism, classism, and religious intolerance. And specifically, in terms of Western Christianity, we have the terrible legacy of colonialism and slavery, which was supported by the theology of the Christian church, with doctrines that, and I quote from Dr. Woodley, have legalized and rationalized the theft of land, labor, and resources from indigenous peoples across the world and systemically denied their human rights. So, hierarchy taken to extremes can be literally devastating. And it is an unfortunate reality that Swedenborg loved to speak in terms of categories and make broad, sweeping statements about those categories as a whole. And that would often be about the spiritual world, but it would also be in regards to gender, race, nationality, and religion. And such generalizations and stereotypes often lead to discrimination, which is why 2 years ago adopted a standing resolution on discrimination, which includes this language. We hereby affirm our responsibility to interpret our texts in the light of love and inclusion, in heaven's light, and categorically reject interpretations of the Bible or of Swedenborg's writings that promote a discriminatory viewpoint. So, let's now contrast these ideas with the indigenist worldview. The basic things that can balance harmful dualism can also contribute to the healing the ills of hierarchy. When no one is categorized as above or apart, whether from creation or each other, then it leads to a different way of doing things, right? The primary assumption is that we are all part of the community of creation, and then relationship building and consensus building becomes the go-to, rather than just trying to make sure that we make it into the above or higher category. And within this framework, then, vulnerability becomes a virtue rather than a weakness. And the reestablishment of balance becomes an important opportunity. So to quote from Dr. Woodley, our Aboriginal spiritual teachers speak of the reestablishment of balance between human beings and the whole of creation as mending the hoop. Mending something requires the acknowledgement of what is broken in the first place. And this requires vulnerability, right, which can only be accessed through an acceptance of our common humanity. Accepting vulnerability as a virtue and an opportunity, rather than a weakness to be exploited, right, from the assumption of our common humanity, then this allows for mending things that need to be mended, and then weaves us into stronger community together. The opposite of vulnerability is, of course, control, which includes the illegitimate use of power. And when we want to address the illegitimate use of power, whether in the past or the present, or like we're talking about here in Western Christianity, right, the acceptance of vulnerability is key because it allows us to actually talk about what is breached or broken. And we can see how just truly integral this is to the work of social justice and the work of anti-racism, right? Because to be able to allow for systemic change, right, structures need to remain pliable. And an acceptance of vulnerability is a huge part of that ability. And if you do want to read a really fantastic passage on the inherent pliability or flexibility of heaven, I do encourage you to look up Secrets of Heaven, number 7038. That's an Easter egg for you. And it's my very favorite passage in the whole of Swedenborg's writings, so let me know what you think. And then just to button up this section on hierarchy, a quick mention that from Swedenborg, we do also have some really lovely teachings on the importance of diversity within unity to bring to bear on the notion of hierarchy. So, alrighty, halfway there, friends. Let's now talk about individualism, right, which defined as giving preference or focus to the individual instead of common or collective interests. So, one of the ways that the Swedenborgian worldview leans into individualism is biblical interpretation. Through our notion of correspondences, the Bible can be read to be saying specific things about our own regenerative process, as well as the glorification of the Lord and the spiritual history of humanity as a whole. But it's this first sense of meaning that is so very potent and useful for us. As adherents of a spiritual tradition and practice, right? So here are the good things about it, right? Hearing God speak to us about our own internal processes, our challenges, and our growth in the Bible is so empowering and connective. We can take these stories that often in the external sense feel confusing and foreign and like they have nothing at all to do with us, and we can know that they have relationship to what we are actually going through. They can have something important to say to us in our lives now. And more so, that this effectiveness in our lives is built into the word on purpose, right, by God's providence. God meant to give us this gift, as opposed to sort of we just do the best interpretation that we can with what we have and mine some meaning from a long ago text in a more random way. It connects us, the internal sense, to and our regenerative process to God and to heaven and to spiritual seekers over the ages in a systematic way. So, what a gift to be able to hear the Bible is all about me, right? This text I'm reading right now can be relevant and effective in my life in this moment. Praise be. So, let's hear it now this way. The Bible is all about me. Sounds a little bit different, right? Because, is it? Like, the Bible is a communal document. It began as oral tradition, stories being told by people to each other, transmitted through groups and subgroups throughout time. The Old Testament, for example, in the form that we see it today, put together during a time of exile for the purpose of connecting a group of people, the Israelites, to each other and their land, while they were separated either in exile or while they were rebuilding their society after their return. The Gospels, written to and for and from different communities of people in the early Jesus movement. And even though they're not in our canon, the epistles are for the most part letters to congregations, to groups of people. Now, Swedenborg doesn't actually say anywhere specifically the Bible is all about us. He just gives examples of what the spiritual meaning is and how it might be understood. And when we couple that with an imperative that theology should be lived, the life of religion is to do good, and that we should try to spiritually progress, regeneration, well then, of course, we apply these understandings to ourselves and the ways that they might actually help us do good and become more loving. The problem is when this individual interpretation is all we do. When our focus is just on our own spiritual process, then we might not be paying attention to communal or systemic issues or issues that feel too big to be tackled alone, like the climate crisis. And so I'd like to offer up this quote from Dr. Woodley. Might be a bit challenging, but I think it's good for us to consider. And it goes thus. In one of the most individualistic societies to ever live, and he means the United States, we have come to believe that salvation is centered on the individual, and that the scriptures were written for me personally. This fallacy results in a loss of corporateness intended by the writers of scripture, and it diminishes the community that interprets the scriptures with me. And he goes on to talk about his own belief that he thinks that Christ is just as concerned with the salvation of all of us together as he is with the salvation of each individual person. And so when he continues to talk about how individualism could be harmful, right, it brings us back to this discussion of dualism, right? An excess of individuality divides reality, right? Concealing the actual reality of our original connectedness. And so we end up living out of these reduced categories, with just of ourselves as the focus, and that just doesn't reflect the reality of creation, which is that we are all integrally related just by the fact of our humanity. And it is really kind of fascinating to bring this to the Swedenborgian context, because what we see in Swedenborg's cosmology is that there's a lot of vertical connectedness, right? So each individual is connected to associate spirits, which are then connected to angels, natural, spiritual, celestial, right, up through the various heavens all the way to God. And we're connected in the other direction too, which is what keeps us in freedom. Or Swedenborg describes the way the word comes to be, right? Coming down from God, mediated through the heavens all the way down to us. And I think this does create a deep and amazing level of cosmic connectedness, but we can also see how it's really centered on the individual as the nexus. I think Swedenborg talks a lot about vertical connectedness, but less about horizontal connectedness, right? How we might be connected to other people or creation. And now, don't come at me because I do know that Swedenborg does talk about collectivity, right? Especially True Christianity 775, right? He specifically talks about both individuals and systems, both being part of the divine design. What I'm saying is I think that he talks about vertical connectedness with more specificity than he does about horizontal connectedness. Those ideas are powerful about the way we are connected horizontally, but they're more abstract and less granular. This is just, the way I'm reading it. And of course, you'll notice my hierarchical language with vertical and horizontal here. It's just built in. So, I'm open to new ways of expressing it. So, what ideas from indigenous theology can we bring alongside these observations? Dr. Woodley describes the indigenous way as embodying the ethos, I am because we are, and the Western way as we are because I am. And I think there are many ways that Swedenborg's theology falls into the second, right? So we talked about the individual being the nexus of vertical connection, but also the way he talks about the human mind as being the smallest, most indivisible unit of the heavenly marriage, which is then patterned throughout creation. I'm wondering what it might look like to shift to a more I am because we are perspective, right, to actively bring in more horizontal connection and not just vertical connection. Because it seems to me that in the Swedenborgian worldview, vertical connectedness is a fact, and horizontal connectedness is a choice, right? Vertical connectedness is a feature of the divine design, right? If you exist, then you're already in this vertically connected matrix, it's done. But our horizontal connectedness is a possibility that we're invited to step into by the choices we make. I'm wondering, what if our horizontal connectedness was understood as more of a given in the first place? I've lost my place. You should see these notes. They're a rabbit warren of changing order of things. So let me just figure out where I'm supposed to go now. Okay. Where's page 8? Okay, got it. All right. So we're asking, what if horizontal connectedness was more of a given, right? Because from an indigenous perspective, which is what I'm trying to bring in right here, if you're in creation, you are not alone, you are already in a community, right? And human beings are made to be in community. So for them, the horizontal connection is what is the given. And we do actually, I think, see this represented in Swedenborg's work in the structure of heaven, right? So first, there's the notion of the grand human, right? That all of heaven appears in the form of a human being and exhibits the same kind of differentiated interdependence as the human body. But I would argue that the application of that notion does sort of lean towards individualism because of the differentiation that drives it. Second, I think, and more importantly for this discussion, is that heaven is structured around communities built on mutual love. So I'll quote from Heaven and Hell 71. Every community in heaven is growing in numbers daily. The more it grows, the more perfect it becomes. And this part is good. So angels long for nothing more than to have new angel guests arrive there. I think this is a hint, right, of very much an I am because we are way of looking at things, right? Longing suggests a principle that's already active, and they're just waiting for the people to come to help embody it. All right, so we are finally ready to move on to the last, utopianism. Defined as living for another world, either in the future or the past, believing that that future or past world is or will be better for us. And we can skip right to the ways it's harmful. Utopianism really is a problem when we focus so much on that other world that we start to think that any ends justify the means of reaching that better world. And we can see tons of examples of this type of thinking in various kinds of religious nationalism and in colonialism, whereby harmful behaviors and policies and practices are justified in order to create societies which embody a utopian, God-pleasing vision, or specifically create the supposed conditions for the second coming. As well, harm can come from a dualistic, faith-alone kind of ideology which discredits this world and everything in it, but guarantees heaven, a future utopia, to those with the right belief, no matter how they might have lived or what destruction they might have wrought. And so, while there have been some parts of the Swedenborgian movement that have had separatist tendencies trying to create unique utopian societies, that is not our particular context here, so I'm just going to put that to the side. What we can recognize, though, in a broader sense, is that the Swedenborgian tradition is not waiting for the second coming and the end times, and we do have a theology that focuses on living a good life now, rather than just sitting and waiting to be raptured. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a vision for the future that we are striving and looking towards. In terms of the individual, we foresee a future for each person in the spiritual world. And in terms of humanity and the world as a whole, we have the collective vision of the New Jerusalem from the book of Revelation. So for the first, in terms of individualism, the upside of the Swedenborgian vision of a place for everyone in heaven who wants it and has tried to live the best life they can of integrity and kindness. That's why a lot of us are here, right? It's beautiful, it's expansive, it's loving. Any potential downsides with that dovetail with the individualism that we were just speaking about. Insofar as we focus on our own potentially better and happier future in heaven, making everything about our personal spiritual growth, then we focus less on our horizontal connections and the various systemic issues that our society needs us to pay attention to now. And that's a problem if we're just essentially biding our time in this world and using this world as like a foil for our own spiritual progress. Now, for the second more collective vision, it's based, of course, on the descent of the New Jerusalem in the book of Revelation, which we've heard a lot of this convention, and it's wonderful. So I'll just read. I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice coming from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and will be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things have passed away." He who was seated on the throne said, "I am making everything new." I don't know about you folks, but I can't read, Revelation 21 and 22 without getting a bit teary-eyed. It's just a really important vision for our church. And this is understandable because it's potent and it's beautiful imagery. Revelation will go on to describe this city as having 12 different gates, a river running through the middle, no night, a tree of life bearing all kinds of fruit, and leaves that will heal the nations, all of which becomes even more meaningful when we explore the spiritual sense, and that's, of course, for another day. But either way, what a vision. I don't know about you, but I'm in. So, it does beg the question, as I skip back, in what ways are we still waiting for the New Jerusalem, for a wonderful utopia that will potentially exist in the future? And to be clear, in case there's anybody new to the Swedenborgian context here, I want to make clear that we're not expecting a literal city to descend from heaven. That's not what we're talking about here. We understand that to mean a new spiritual consciousness that is arising within people that will, of course, then have physical and social manifestations in this world. And some of the reasons that we might still feel like we're waiting has to do with the fact that Swedenborg is not exactly clear on how or a timeline for the arrival of this new spiritual consciousness. And that's, probably a good thing overall. But he talks variably about how a new church will emerge on the earth, then a new heaven has to be formed first. It has to be established by the Lord at the end of the previous church. That in the doctrine of the Lord, it says both the Lord will establish it, but he also has established it. He talks about it being an internal phenomenon. The new heaven creates the new church within each of us. And then the more this new heaven grows, the more the New Jerusalem becomes manifest. And finally, he says that it cannot take place in a moment, but takes place to the extent that the falsities of the former church are put aside. We do have to note that this last one is a real sticky wicket, because it formed the justification for some new church in action around slavery in the Americas. So basically, the idea was the world's a mess because of the falsities that exist in the Christian church, and nothing that we do socially will make any difference until that church is reformed. And so many did nothing. And that's totally not great. And for those who want to know more about that, Jim Lawrence has a great article with further research. But we might still be waiting even the most basic way. And I know this is operative for me, because the external imagery of Revelation 21, the New Jerusalem descending, subconsciously might dispose us to think of it as something that will happen in the future, and it's kind of magical, and it sort of has nothing to do with us now. And I know for myself, this kind of thinking disposes us to inaction on important social issues. So, how might indigenous theology bring interesting or balance to our ideas about the New Jerusalem? I offer this final quote from Dr. Woodley. An honest, shalom-based salvation or healing is not ethereal, but very much earthbound. We should be suspicious of salvation theologies that hold a future in heaven as more important to us than our time on earth is now. Shalom or harmony is primarily about now. And so I wonder if assimilating this idea might help us make something of a cognitive shift, right? Instead of the manifestation of the New Jerusalem as something we are waiting for, or even something that we need to make the world ready for, what if instead the New Jerusalem is waiting on us? And what if the vision of the New Jerusalem is not about the future at all, but about right now? How would this change how we act? Would we act with more urgency, more compassion, more connection, more charity, more groundedness? And my first impulse is to say, well, these are questions that each of us have to answer for ourselves. And they are, but this is also my individualism bias coming out, right? Certainly, these questions could and should be ones that we work on corporately together. And so this circles us back around to my personal framework for doing this mini course as a representative of Swedenborgians in action against racism. A New Jerusalem that only exists for me in some beautiful future disconnected from my real life, this leads to complacency. I know that I feel comforted by it, but then I am also just more complacent. A New Jerusalem that exists for me in the now. It may still need more space, much more architecture, much more dismantling of harmful ideas, and many more workers in the vineyard, but that New Jerusalem is alive. It needs each of us, and it needs us now. And boy, that is intimidating, but it is also kind of amazing. So that's what I have. Thanks for listening. Does anyone have questions? Woo, yes. I mean, they need to come down, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to bring up the chat right now.
All righty, awesome. Yay.
If you have mobility issues, you can just say it to us and we can repeat it over the mic.
Can you get stop share?
I don't know what that. Oh, yes. Yeah. Stop share.
Yeah, and then so no one sees my crazy life, we're going to do one of these. And then we can bring the chat up so you can see it. Everyone. Okay.
Yeah, that's what it was.
Is this microphone down here working? Is this on? Is this microphone on? Gladys. Oh, it is.
It is now. Thank you. Yeah, so sometimes I get nervous and then I lose my words, but I'm asking the Lord to help this come out okay, what I'd like to share with people is something that came to me. Actually, it was either not the last convention or something, but anyway. Okay. Thank you. At a point where I was sitting still, because that happens to bring things forward a lot. And I felt like I was hearing inside being spoken to me, but, that's just enough of a description, okay. I was thinking about this whole New Jerusalem thing, and what have you. And what came to me was the golden walkways, all right, of the New Jerusalem are the golden pathways of the, the golden rule, all right? So the golden rule roughly, broadly says, do unto others, and I think maybe all of us are familiar with it in one way or another, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And if we live that way, then that will lead to the what's the words I'm looking for? What is it? The beloved community.
Yeah.
So the collective thing we're looking at is beloved community, and that basically that's really the description of heaven. Is of beloved community. What's beautiful, and what was being brought to my consciousness and what have you, all of the religions, and I don't think that all is inaccurate. So I think I'm safe in saying that. But at least all what we call the major religions, but I don't really want to say it here. All of the religions that have people really collected in it and wanting to live that way and so forth and so on, have some form of that admonition to their people in some form. So it's in all different languages and all the different religions and what have you. So we have that on earth, and it's functional in heaven, in common. If we were to look at that and say, oh, you believe the same thing I believe. Oh, you believe the same thing I believe. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So we can start there even and say, oh, you know what, we don't have to fight over this, whose religion is better than the other one and this and that and the other. In each religion, there's something about being concerned about, not just concerned with, but concerned about the other. But it's also about ourselves as well, and looking for the other to be concerned about us. So here you have a kind of vertical and a kind of horizontal. So that was one thing, and I'm trying to tell this to people a lot as much as I can. The other thing is, a lot of times, Swedenborgians, and I hate that term actually, but anyway, because we're God's people, I'm not Swedenborg's people, and so anyway, the cross, what? Is about the horizontal and the vertical. And what happens? It comes together in the middle. The horizontal and the vertical meet. And where is our Lord Jesus Christ? Right in the middle of the cross, okay? But how are our bodies constructed? Vertically and horizontally, all right? So, and if we look at the animal world or what have you, you see, what's the word? Not intimations, but reflections of the human form, both in plants and animals and what have you. So there's something about that. And I hope that we never think we can invent a, what's the word I want? What's the favorite word these days? The we look to solve all our problems. What is it?
A solution?
Yeah, but there's what is
Artificial intelligence.
no, what is it? No, it's mathematical. What is it?
An equation?
The algorithm. Okay, okay. Heaven forbid, in a sense, that somebody say, "Oh, we've discovered the divine algorithm." Well, can I suggest that we have not discovered the divine algorithm until we've met the Lord Jesus Christ? Okay, because all of these things, the horizontal and the vertical, are all contained right there in full operation. So that's that. So the other piece in this has to do with how we value each other. What kind of this hierarchical thing that we think has something to do with how we think one thing is more important than the other, and I want to be associated with the more important thing. However, what do the Beatitudes say? Blessed are the poor in spirit. For what? You can complete it, because right now my memory isn't staying with me. Blessed, who knows the yeah, pardon? Okay, all right, you see, all right. And what did the Lord tell his disciples, the apostles that were, who was the greatest? The one was doing the most service, okay? So here we have just exactly what you're talking about here. So we have all of the beginnings of it in our teachings and what have you. And then the other thing, see if I can get this right now, because it's my remembrance from the writings, but it has to do with the same thing. So it's about the parallels in the Bible, you know, internal, external sense, blah blah blah, all of that. Great. It's not coming to me right this minute now, so okay. But here it is. That the Bible, and we're speaking of the Hebrew Bible, but also we use the Hebrew Bible as our standard. But all the other, if you look at the other religious writings and what have you, actually you'll find the same messages in all of them in one way or another. So the divine wisdom is present in all of these different things if we look at it. Okay, and what does it work on? And we use the term regeneration, okay? So that's the rebuilding, if you will, of our real human self, because that's the self that's after the pattern of the divine human self, okay? So, gosh, I hate this, and I lose my words. Oh, yes. So the biblical story, at least as we use it anyway, but not only, is our story, because it is the story of the regenerative process. So it's the story of a process and not just of an individual who's going to be the most excellent in the top drawer and the what, and all the other things we use to, what is it? Yeah. Yes. Thank you. to dismiss one another and the other. So then one more thing, and I'll try to shut up. That the Lord brought to my attention at a certain point. What is one of the names? And actually, it's one of the names. Is what? And I don't ask me to say it in Hebrew, because right now I won't be able to. I am. Who can complete it? Come on, somebody knows.
I am that I am.
That I am. And not only I am that I am, but I am what? Who I am. Okay? And if we are made in the image and likeness of God, we can stake that. When we say that I am who I am, that is a prayer, and it's also a call for the I am within us to speak that to and to receive that from the I am who I am. So we need to be careful. Each person is an I am who I am. If we claim it, we'll claim our own worthwhileness in the sight of God because God created us in the image and likeness of God. We can't get around it. It's there if we'll accept it, okay? Each one of us is important. Each one of us is important to the collective, and the collective is important to each one of us.
Thank you, Gladys. Thank you so much. There's lots of beautiful things to lift up in what you just said. I want to talk about just two. I love how you talk, you connected the imagery of the golden rule and the golden streets of the city. What a wonderful application if we could all imagine every step we take in our lives living the golden rule is walking the New Jerusalem as it exists right now here with us. So that's beautiful. And then also the invoking the cross, again, such an important thing in the practice of vulnerability, right? To be able to create these pliable structures, we need to remember the cross being so important in mending things with each other. Thank you, Gladys. I guess that's up.
Oh, he's going to have to come down here. If you could just put it on the table.
Okay, yes. Thank you so much for this presentation. It's given me quite a bit to think about. I guess I'll just mention two things. So much is cyclical. I got caught on the I am because we are, and the we are because I am. And I found myself jotting sort of an I am because we are, because I am, because we are, and I am. It does seem to work that way.
Right.
And another thing that was on my mind was the, which one do I go here? I don't think that we can avoid individualism in many ways because all is reflective of one individual. So glad you brought up the I am. We're all relating ourselves to that in some way and trying to live up to what that greatest isness is, and it is an individual. And so I like the warnings about the dangers of individualism and where it can take us. And at the same time, there is that human responsibility where everyone for themselves choose this day whom you will serve. As for me and my house, right? It's an individual choosing to opt into community. And so I think that might be some of why there are some vagaries when it comes to the horizontal. The vertical is of the doctrines is giving us this cosmology, is spelling out a universe that people don't yet understand and need these details. And so Swedenborg is saying, this is how it works in great detail. The horizontal is where the freedom is preserved. I don't get to opt in or out of existence in that cosmic sense. I do get to opt in or out of being a schmuck. Right? And so that's where the choice element seems to come in. And so I wonder if that's why we don't get too much there. The scripture has already given it. What more do you need, right? The commandments are pretty clear, pretty simple. They take a lifetime to figure out and to live, and even there we stumble all the way. But that cosmology is where we get a lot of that detail. So I wonder if the reason it's left a little vague is a little bit like why Swedenborg leaves the governance stuff vague. I mean, he's a part of government, he knows how it works, and he gives, a few passages in the Arcana, which he then repeats in NJHD. It's vague so that we can, as we need to, opt in, choose, and modify so that we can live it here by choice. So, but the warnings are very clear, and I'm glad to hear them through this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris. Anyway, the choice part, right, is so integral in everything because it's what creates us, as individual beings, creates heaven within us. And I wonder if part of the work we could do in shifting it is shift the starting point, right? Because for the choice, the horizontal choice field, right, we're not starting from zero connectedness and then making every part of our connectedness. What if we're starting at, a base level of connectedness that we all accept, and then we work to enliven and enrich and create even more connectedness. I wonder if that's a small shift that could help us feel, understand that actually we can't, even if we wanted to, completely opt into being a schmuck, if there's maybe like a base level of connectedness that we can't get out of. I feel like maybe that could be an interesting way to shift some of our thinking.
At the very minimum, you have two parents.
Absolutely.
If we see the chat, if we see what happened in the chat.
Oh, okay. So I can read some of the things that are in the chat. So from Reverend Eric Hoffman, hi Eric. I've come to understand that Swedenborg was a man of his time and therefore embedded in the thought that saturated his culture. We really don't know much about we didn't know how much he knew about the indigenous cultures of those British colonies across the Atlantic. Our challenge in reading Swedenborg is to sift out the ideas that draw upon his culture and to focus on the ideas that are more universal. Reading Swedenborg critically, in other words. No short answer to that question. Page continues with, Eric, I agree with you. I view Swedenborg as a great intellectual mystic who is embedded in his time and culture. I like your concept of sifting out the ideas that draw upon his culture and to focus on ideas that are more universal. Still, he celebrates love towards the neighbor as one of the purest that we may incorporate into our doctrines. Plenty of opportunity for us to develop community as an expression of our heavenly orientation. And Milena tells us, beautiful, I also feel it is important to remember that alone time with God is needed for everyone. Sure, yes, so like part of an individual connection to God. And each called to do so in unique time spans due to differences in our purpose in the world. So from Reverend Eric, loving it, perhaps a heavenly life is dependent upon our being able to grow into a balance between living with ourselves and living with others. Certainly, yes. Wonderful comments. And Lon offers the note that indigenous culture often uses a circle or a hoop that surrounds the four directions. East-west, horizontal, and north-south, vertical. So again, talking about the integration of what we're talking about, or in theological terms, the cross. Ooh, a circle around a cross. Where have I seen that? Tricky. And then Reverend Eric asks, how can we honor the diversity of cultures and philosophies without treading into cultural appropriation? Oh, that's one. I'm not going to pretend I have a good answer for that. But if anyone else does, I think certainly permission is important, respect is important, effort is important, right, to understand and not just, take or claim. How those things become enacted, right? I don't have any rules, but I feel like those things are an important part of cross-cultural engagement. Yeah, any other? Well, yes, that's the first ground in which we have to begin accepting the common humanity and value of each other, absolutely.
And it's a matter of sharing ideas versus trying to assimilate culture.
Sure, so a sharing, it was offered that it was a sharing of ideas as opposed to assimilation, right? This is a great evil of colonialism, right? The devaluing of the indigenous cultures and assimilating them into Western culture instead of a coexistence based on respect, which my understanding is the ways in which the indigenous cultures welcomed the people, the settlers, They weren't coming from a sense of immediately assuming the other was bad. And there was not the similar good faith.
Sean, you have a virtual person who wants to speak, and you have a 4-minute one.
So do I need to do something?
No, Rudy's going to take
Oh,
care of it.
great. You can go ahead. Addition. Thank you. Chris.
A quick question. The hierarchy thing.
Uh-huh.
The most ancient, Swedenborg says.
We can't hear you.
Oh, Shimony.
Yeah, we need the,
So it'd be-
if it was a quick question, you could.
Yeah, well,
I don't think.
no such thing as quick questions, I guess. The way that Swedenborg handles the most ancients. Swedenborg talks about them having their hierarchy of family and hierarchy and community. And I'm not versed in indigenous, but I think that's as close to indigenous as we get with Swedenborg. And the vision of them through the spiritual world is one that still has some of the things that are warned against and also conceptualized differently in what you were talking about. I'm wondering if you could speak to that, perhaps disconnect between what Swedenborg was saying indigenously and what you're presenting here.
That might be beyond the depth of my research on these. Again, I don't claim to be any kind of expert on indigenous culture. I'm working with these particular ideas that I was exposed to with this particular speaker. But the way I think about it is I wonder if, returning to the idea that it's all about balance, right? And Dr. Woodley was super clear about that. He's not trying to demonize any particular way of thinking, but to just note, you lean too far in one direction, you get bad results, right? The idea is to bring things back into balance. So it's not so much that, that hierarchy can't work in certain situations. I think we recognize that there are lots of healthy patriarchal and matriarchal systems in which elders are revered and they're wisdom keepers and they're so I think that there's ways in which distinction and hierarchy can be healthy, but I guess it's held lightly, or it's held within the assumption of, or it's held without dualism, perhaps, right? It's held without it's maybe somehow separated from we are other and then first and then hierarchy created. If it's created within the context of connection, then maybe it becomes about respect and not about division and dominion and so maybe it's just as simple as a small shift like that. The same idea, but what's its root? Where does it come from? And that depends on how it grows, right?
Yeah.
We're at time. Thank you, everybody. This is really fun. Can I take a picture of you all before you head out? Oh, I'm so bad at that. You don't want to see a self it's just not it's not something I have a talent for. Thank you so much, everybody. Oh, yes. Yes. Thank you, online friends. All right. Thank you. I'm done.